There's probably nothing that might be simpler and sadder. Wanda has lost Mono. Was she family? Was she love? That we will never know. As her fate was cursed, Mono was sacrificed. After stealing a sword, Wanda travels to faraway lands forbidden to mortals so that the young girl's soul can be recovered. As he lays Mono on an altar, Wanda is interrupted by the appearance of 5 anthropomorphic shapes, like shadow creatures. With a simple gesture, armed with his stolen sword, undoubtedly a magic weapon, he fends them off. A voice makes itself heard. Dormin, an entity whose speech we can only hear, a double voice, both male and female, coming from an opening in the sky. Attracted by the sword, Dormin listens to Wanda. Only one thing counts for the young man, bringing Mono back to life. The rest doesn't seem to matter, not even the fact that such a prodigy is a priori impossible for mortals. Yet Dormin can. On one condition: destroy, in an order dictated by Dormin, the 16 statues of Colossi which are standing before the altar. No human, however, is strong enough to do this. It requires the destruction of other, real Colossi, each of which protecting a part of these forbidden lands. They are the embodiment of these statues. Once each Colossus has been destroyed, its statue will shatter. Once all 16 statues have shattered, Mono will be resurrected. Accompanied by his faithful mare Agro, Wanda sets off. This is the story of Shadow of the Colossus, a game developed by Team Ico, whose soundtrack, one of the most beautiful in video game history, was composed by Ko Tani. Released in 2005 for the PS2, it was remastered for the PS3 in 2011, before a magnificent remake was made in 2018 for the PS4, developed by Bluepoint Games. Part of the soundtrack was reworked and modified, reorchestrated for the occasion. It's this version of the game that I'm going to analyze. Little is known about Wanda. His relationship with Mono, probably romantic one, is not actually revealed. It's of no importance. Wanda has no name. Even this first name doesn't seem to be his. It's an apocope of wanderer, or even a verb. He's defined by an action. Besides, is he really a wanderer? He knows where he's going. He doesn't claim to belong to a country, a people, or a tribe. He only asks for the return of Mono's soul. He is therefore entirely defined, at least for us, by his requests. It's his ties, albeit concealed, with Mono that lead him to the impenetrable, a strange mix of hope and banishment, of impossible and bargaining. It's a very firm request. Mono must be given back her soul. How did he come to know these forbidden lands, of this strange entity, Dormin, and of this spell that is just as strange? How did he find out about the sword he stole? Nothing is explained. Nothing will ever be. He has even features, without angles, but without personality, what you could call a male lead, with his long auburn hair, his rather pale face. It seems to me that his face had a little more character in the original version after all. Here it's particularly smooth, like a doll. Only his clothes could connect him to a specific place through the style of his tunic, and the patterns we'll find on the other characters' clothes and the sigils of the Colossi, but when we see him for the first time, we can't really tell. Although he is immediately defined as a young man strongly attached to Mono, Wanda is not introduced as a real knight, at least is not perfect. His animation is quite meaningful. He has a strong bond with Agro, his horse, and is therefore very comfortable with her. In particular, he can ride on her back as she is at full gallop. On the other hand, his animation on foot is much less fluid. When he runs, his legs are stretched out. It's strange. His rolls are a bit heavy. He picks himself up with difficulty, but this is much more realistic than doing a series of perfect rolls, as in Any Souls, unless you have the infamous fat roll, of course. And we see him stumbling a lot. The way he swims isn't elegant either. A large part of his gameplay involves climbing. It's a bit acrobatic, as you can and have to jump and then cling to the surface you're climbing, but clearly less athletic and supple than the animation of Aloy, for example, who has very active movements, or less peaceful than Link. Wander is essentially in a situation of fragility, clinging to obstacles with one hand as if he were about to fall, and his sound design, limited but present, very much intends to express this danger, this humanity. There are notably many throat noises that convey his efforts. Wander's small size compared to most of the Colossi and his lack of elegance will give a very special appearance to the fights, where Wander appears as a frail silhouette tossed about in all directions, a mere ant clinging to the Colossi as if to his mission, or a small thing carefully examined by Medus, relying on his stamina and the stability of his grip. Attacks must be charged, and any loss of balance cancels the attack. The same goes for jumps during climbing. If you switch back to one hand on account of the Colossus movements, you can no longer jump. There is, of course, heavy fall damage, without which the game would be too easy since falling is part of the gameplay, and Wander loses his balance when shaken by the Colossus, when Gaius strikes the ground with its sword, for example, which sometimes also deals damage, depending on the difficulty mode. For the two small Colossi, Celosia and Zenobia, Wander even turns into a bull rider as soon as he lands on their body, but despite the often surprising appearance of the combat, which could almost turn into a form of comedy, the game avoids this direction by constantly reminding us of the creature's suffering. The image of the hero has therefore already been dented in several respects. Firstly, Wander calls for something that is, in all likelihood, impossible, saving Mono after she's dead, and we might even think that he has failed to save her before, although nothing is said about this. But above all, this turns the image of the hero on its head. He's not the one being called upon, he's the one behind the request. Then he acts on Dormin's orders. There's a kind of submission in Wander who ultimately shows little feeling towards the divine entity and only thinks about Mono. He is, however, ready to face the 16 Colossi and brushes aside Dormin's warning about the price he will have to pay. No sacrifice, not even that of his own life, seems to frighten him. Secondly, when moving or in combat, Wander lacks the elegance you would expect of a classic hero. Moreover, he uses his sword, the one he stole, fairly basically. The first time it's needed when he's attacked by the shadow creatures, he simply brandishes it and that's enough to repel them. In combat, he simply repeats the same charged attack over and over. Wander doesn't seem to be a talented swordsman, at least that's not what the game will show. To underline the ambivalence of the quest of this broken but determined hero, a quest into which he dives blindly at once and which unfortunately leads him to destroy completely innocent creatures who are obviously suffering, the game will, through all its aspects, assert, albeit with great finesse, its very austere character. This austerity is evident in the colors. The overall color palette of Shadow of the Colossus is quite restrained. It's a coherent place rendered in a graphic style that, while not being totally photorealistic, aims to be realistic, concrete and very believable, convincing, and the emphasis on nude shades reflects the dominant materials: stone, sand, grass, water, and not much else. The main colors are therefore grey, beige, various shades of green and brown for the wood. When looking at the whole thing, it's indeed a sense of sobriety that you feel when you see these vast expanses, a sobriety that the almost total absence of sunlight will bring out. The sky in the Forbidden Lands is covered in thick clouds through which the light can sometimes be seen a little, but too little. Before that, in the introduction at sunrise, it almost looks as if the image is in black and white. On the previous versions, PS2 and 3, it was even more striking, very washed out and essentially grey-green, with much less contrast, although this particular shot was more colorful, brighter. The non-natural structures, buildings such as the shrine, often quite elaborate, carved with motifs reminiscent of those on the characters' clothing, seem to have been there for a long time. They're often partially destroyed and also showing these faded colors. Stone is slowly overrun by moss. What's more, the characters' clothes, Wander's, Mono's, Lordimon and his men's, show similar, even more faded tones. A very, very pale mauve and green can be seen on Mono's dress. Despite the opulence with which these lands are introduced at first, it's almost grandiose in the introduction, the immensity suggested by these vast expanses, it is austerity which remains afterwards. However, there are a few more colorful elements to liven things up. In particular, there are a few flowers like poppies or the purple flowers in the vegetation that you can climb, and other more intense touches of color via the fauna thanks to the fireflies and many cyan butterflies like blue morphos. The grass is often short and yellowed, almost burnt in places, but the forest gives a little humidity to this often dry world. Wide stretches of sand are legion. But above all, as we progress in Wander's quest, the path to the Colossi leads us to discover some more welcoming areas, from the spring just before arriving in Kumomori's arena to the spectacular panorama of the falls. The large springs provide a welcome contrast with the vast, arid plains, and I must admit I was surprised to see such landscapes in the Forbidden Lands. It's an austere but beautiful place, spectacular at times, and whose composition is always exemplary. The generous render distance of this remake allows us to appreciate this. As these more welcoming areas were revealed, I couldn't help but see a form of irony in it, as Wander's appearance changes with his victories. He's visibly becoming paler and paler, black mottling starts appearing on his skin, the young man looks cadaverous, the beauties of the world open up to us, but Wander belongs less and less to said world. Despite this, the battles against the Colossi systematically bring us back, in the color palettes I mean, to the initial austerity under generally overcast sky. The design of the Colossi and the way the battles are handled are different, but I talk about that later. These lands are explored very quietly. There can be a great deal of exploration, for in spite of the ancient sword and Dormin's clue to the whereabouts of the next Colossus, clues that aren't the most precise, alas, the Forbidden Lands are vast. This exploration is, for Wander, nothing more, rather nothing less, than a hunt, and while the player may try to give in to exploration, and actually enjoy it, roaming the lands as they wish, they won't find anything in the world, quests, NPCs, or out of it, by which I mean extra diegetic elements, notably one, music. But let's start with the sound design. Just as the graphical austerity is not total, the absence of music and non-diegetic sounds, apart from the safe shrines or consulting the map, leaves room for some pleasant elements, wind peacefully blowing and birds gently singing. However, they are disturbed by the sound of Agro's hooves and Wander's shouts, so as to encourage his mount, which are way louder. Far from innocent, these, again if we only take into account Wander's quest and not any free exploration by the player, these are a sonic mark of this hunt, the young man's sole objective, as they reflect his progression towards the next Colossus. This exploration is never accompanied by music. There are no rewards, a new theme or music that would suddenly appear after a long time without music, as in Stray or even Inside. Everything is connected to Mono, then to the Colossi. The arrival in their lair is often accompanied by a musical cue, then the music changes several times for the fight itself. They will contribute to the strangeness of our experience, highlighting the fight structure, from the tension of the approach to the explosion of adrenaline, but it's a little more complex than that if we keep in mind how the fight actually looks like. The most open and extroverted music, leaving a strange sensation in the end. I developed this music in the part about the Colossi. Apart from that, there's no music, which means that most of the game takes place in the silence, albeit discreetly dressed, of nature, a diegetic silence. Of course, this restraint in sound design contributes to a form of immersion by putting us in sonic conditions which feel close to reality. But it might be just as immersive to have a rich score that makes you dive into the world of a game, only to emerge again at the very end. If I made an early 2-hour video on musical loops in my series on Ori, it's because I find it quite fascinating the way in which the score of Ori and the Will of the Wisps seems to be a huge movement taking us from one end of Nightwind to the other, with notably the use of specific music for transition zones, enabling us to move from one key to another, from one theme to another, absolutely seamlessly. Immersion can therefore also work through abundance, for instance. There's another type of immersion in the latest installments of the Zelda franchise, but it is often pointed out, and quite rightly so, that the silence that settles in during the majority of Wander's quests can arouse something else. In the chapter devoted to Shadow of the Colossus from Music in Video Games, Studying Play, chapter entitled Wandering Tonalities, Silence, Sound and Morality in Shadow of the Colossus, William Gibbons discusses at length the idea that silence, inevitable since it's an intrinsic part of the game, you have to roam the plains in silence to find the next Colossus arena, can ultimately lead us back to our own solitude as we precisely lose the sense of immersion, being given the space to question the ethical ramifications of our actions. There may be a profound split between both the characters and the player's experience, but Wander isn't a completely empty character. He's not Link. We can have an opinion on his quest. There's a strange opposition between the questions the player may ask themselves about Wander's quest and the absence of questions Wander seems to ask himself. The highly immersive aspect of this silence, which progressively becomes more and more disturbing, can lead here to a kind of reflection and distance from Wander that we don't get with Link, to compare him with someone who might be even less characterized. I think we ask ourselves far fewer questions about what's driving Link than about what's driving Wander. Once again, we can also enjoy this silence, this absence of enemies other than the next Colossus of quest, and appreciate this solitude, but, and I'm not pretending to mention anything new, it's a very well-known aspect of the game. This silence raises the question from the music's point of view. Remaining immersed in silence is one way to imply that exploration is not a source of abandon for Wander. He doesn't give in to the admittedly austere beauty of the Forbidden Lands, which would then result in the appearance of musical elements, generally non-intrusive in this type of exploration, and would either translate the playable character's state of mind or suggest the player the emotions to feel, but music can also be more connected to the world itself than the characters. There are many possibilities anyway. Silence also applies to the characters. Neither Wander, after the introduction, nor the Colossi speak. All we hear, the cries of pain they all laid out. Only Mono is heard calling out to Wander in the world of the souls. I'll come back to this later. Then Wander repeats Agra's name after her sacrifice. Apart from both the prologue and the epilogue, only Domin actually speaks, orders, and even then, they often use the same words. Wander's emotions are limited. His sadness is implied, is understandably devastated by Mono's death, but he never shows direct anger. This is a choice that can be interpreted primarily by the pacing of the game. Shadow of the Colossus isn't necessarily a long game. Although there's a puzzle dimension that can drag some of the battles out, you have to understand how to apprehend each Colossus, but it is a slow game. Yet it's a boss rush in a way, except that here everything's slow. It's visually slow. All the cutscenes are made up of long sequences, long shots with very slow camera movements. The pace is all the slower because the world is so big, so immense. It takes a long time to explore it, and there's no teleportation, which is another form of austerity. Wander's Quest can be seen as a test. Nothing should ever feel simple, nothing should ever make the trial easier. It's a world that seems to be designed for the Colossi, designed for giants, not for Wander. The bridge, the expanses, the monuments, everything is immense. It takes several minutes to run across the bridge. When Wander arrives at the temple, he goes down a long spiral ramp. All this takes time. There are a lot of long shots to show the 2 long rows of statues in particular, but the camera movements are varied enough to compensate for this slowness. I'd also like to think that this is a way of illustrating a form of omnipresence of Dormin, as if this supposedly purely vocal entity were a more complete presence, but several shots can also have a narrative function, of course. I'll come back to this. Animations are also rather slow, as when Wander jumps off his horse. Above all, the Colossi are massive and therefore also slow for the most part, as when the penultimate Colossus stamps its foot or sword on the ground, and all the death cutscenes, without exception, are slow. Whatever its size, the Colossus slowly and heavily collapses to the ground. But more than that, it's the whole game that's slow, its atmosphere certainly, and its gameplay. There are 16 Colossi to take down. That's a lot. Then, again, there were supposed to be 48 Colossi, but that number was reduced, first to 24, then to 16 for various reasons. For each Colossus, we start at the altar. Dormin gives a clue as to its location in the Forbidden Lands, and Wander sets off in search of it, which can take a long time as the lands are immense regarding the amount of things to do there. Even if we head in the right direction, it can take a long time to reach the Colossus lair, since we can't climb just any surface, so we often have to find a way to get to the other side of a cliff. Exploration is essentially done on horseback and you stay on the ground, so climbing is minimal. Once you've arrived, the fight is a bit special. It's not a classic boss fight, focusing essentially on hand-to-hand combat, as the Colossi are too big or too fast for that. You have to reach the sigils on their body, their weak points, and stab them several times with your sword. This means you have to find a way to climb each of the Colossi. This can take some time. Once you're on them, reaching their weak points is no easy matter either, and here again, it may take us several attempts to get there, either because we've been thrown off balance and fell on the ground, or because the Colossus follows cycles. Hydrus, for example, doesn't stay on the water surface indefinitely and after a few minutes goes back underwater where we can't attack it. We have to climb on it again. The same goes for Pelagia, which requires us to repeat the same process several times, as does Phalanx, whose symbols are hidden after a while. So there's a repetitive nature to the fight itself, although there are speedrun techniques to avoid this, or just be decent at this. After each battle, we are brought back to the altar in the most ominous way. Long tendrils emerge from the Colossus where it was wounded and violently and ineluctably come to possess us, stabbing us in their turn. Wander then collapses, waking up just in front of the altar after having had a vision of a tunnel in black and white, as if he had passed through the world of the souls. Surrounded by the shadow creatures seen in the introductory cutscene, who are now watching him, as many as the number of Colossi defeated so far, as many as the number of fragments of Dormin's soul released, Wander witnesses the destruction of the statue of the Colossus he has just slain. The creatures then disappear. The young man rises to his feet, invariably looking at Mono, then looking up. Dormin gives him a new clue. Agro comes back to the shrine, and Wander goes back into battle. This series of sequences is repeated 16 times. That's a lot. It's repetitive but perfectly chosen. A large number of Colossi emphasize Wander's determination, his steadfastness. He never questions, never doubts, at least it's not expressed or even implied. Once he accepts Dormin's deal, he does everything to accomplish his mission. and nothing else. The unchanging gameplay cycle is thus part of a long tunnel of confrontations. Every 4 colossi there's a slightly longer cutscene. First, we see Wander and Agro approach Mono. Then, after Kumomori, Mono awakens as if in a memory or a premonition, and Wander, after pronouncing her name, returns next to her body. After the 12th Colossus, we discover Lordiman, a shaman searching for Wander, accompanied by his men, and of course after the 16th Colossus, the long epilogue. This rhythm will never be interrupted by another quest or request. The only other gameplay element consists of finding 2 kinds of collectibles, 3 in the remake. Fruit, consuming them increases the life bar. Lizard tails, they increase the stamina bar, crucial for combat. And in the remake, coins. After collecting the 79 relics, you get Dormin's sword. The progression is perfectly linear, as each Colossus is patiently slain one by one. In the structure of the game, even the introduction and conclusion are long in several parts. The introduction is in 2 parts, the arrival in the Forbidden Lands, and then the dialogue with Dormin. The conclusion stretches out over 20 minutes with the credits in between. We witness Wander's transformation and his death at the hands of Lordiman, followed by the epilogue and the strange hope of a life in these unwelcoming lands. In addition to the structure, the gameplay too shows this austerity and slowness. It can't be fun, it can't be varied, so there's no magic, no combo, nor finish move, just an acupuncture attack that you can charge to do more damage. So it's slow, and I'll come back to this in a moment. It's a wound inflicted on them, not virtuosic hand-to-hand combat, or a jump attack. The other available weapon, the bow, is of little use other than to attract the Colossus and trigger a specific pattern. It does very little damage, forcing us to climb the Colossus every time. The sigils are invisible anyway unless the sword is equipped. There are objects you can obtain later, but they are not part of the base game of the first playthrough. Those are rewards from the time attack mode mostly. Moreover, as I mentioned earlier, the size of the Colossus often implies a significant inertia. For slow-moving Colossi, especially armed ones, each phase of the attack, the anticipation, the attack itself, then the recovery, takes time, which makes the attack look rather ineluctable. You can move away, but the attack is bound to happen. You can't stop it, and although they're inevitable, they're sometimes hard to predict, since armed Colossi are gigantic and the camera isn't far away, so you can't see them completely unless you're far away. It's not easy to anticipate where the fist, foot, or weapon is going to strike, for example with Gaius, who has a very long reach and a particular angle with its sword. However, while Wander's gameplay and abilities are limited, the gameplay associated with the Colossi, that is to say the way we have to climb them and access said symbols, is varied. Avian dives towards us as soon as we shoot it with an arrow, and we simply have to jump to climb on its wing, whereas Zenobia requires quite a bit of platforming before losing part of its armor, not to mention the fantastic Malus, which we have to patiently approach, then climb. The variety and the sumptuous design of the Colossi provide the impetus needed to offset the immutability of the game structure. With such a pace, slow to the point of being very solemn, any flash of temper from Wander could already feel out of place. This apparent and supposed impassivity can also be connected with something deeper. Defining, characterizing Wander solely by his demand to have Mono's soul recovered, revealing nothing else apart from his stealing the ancient sword, is a way to make him a page that's almost completely blank. And it is, for me, a way of not portraying Wander as a purely bad person. For it's a point that's often made, what Wander is doing is wrong. When Dormin asks Wander to destroy the statues via the Colossi, they don't explain why this must be done. It's solely the condition for Mono's soul to be brought back. The Colossi apparently do no harm, are guilty of nothing, and for good reason. There is no one in these lands which are off limits to mortals. The Colossi have thus done nothing. What's more, they're all zoomorphic or anthropomorphic beasts. The Colossi are, in fact, creatures with a particular structure. They are covered in thick brown fur that Wander can cling to. Some have a more prominent bony structure that cannot be climbed, notably Phaedra, and sometimes have several armor parts that enable them to be climbed on. For example, Vadus, the first Colossus, has a platform on its back. How convenient. They vary greatly in size and morphology. Some look like birds, others like eels or even large anthropomorphic creatures. Some, like Gaius or Argus, have quite human limbs. The last one in particular, Malus, is very much humanized. It's particularly touching in the way it looks at us, and the solemn music of this final battle adds to the strange atmosphere. They all emit cries of agony with every stab, and when they succumb to Wander's fatal stab. They respond to our attack, they attack in return except for Phalanx, who never attacks us directly, but above all they feel our stabs as an aggression. They violently and literally try to shake us off. They are animals we disturb, we attack. The violent stabs empty them of their blood as it creates a black geyser. Every injury is visible. These creatures are deeply wounded in particularly painful places on their body, very often the top of the head, the wings of the birds. It's often necessary to wound them to make them change posture and reach their symbols. We also hit Pelagia's teeth repeatedly and pierce Phalanx gas bladders. Some have more specific reactions, such as Celosia, who seems to be afraid of fire. You can be sensitive to its own fear, reflecting a form of fragility that you, the player, not Wander, would rather want to protect. Why inflict something on it that scares it so much, then causes it to suffer a heavy fall? I'll admit I am quite fond of Celosia. It's not my favorite fight, but it's one of my favorite Colossi. It's cute, is all. Perhaps we also feel their humanity all the more easily because they are the characters whose emotions, suffering above all, are the most obvious. Wander has little emotions, except strangely after Dormin takes possession of him and he struggles, desperately wanting to see Mono alive one last time, and Mono herself never shows anything but a peaceful face. Only Lord Demon's anger is expressed more directly. Last but not least, their eyes can be very troubling. They're an important part of the gameplay, turning from cerulean blue to orange when the Colossus is attacking. We have to pay close attention to them, and in some cases their gaze becomes rather disturbing, as for Dirge, who is actively pursuing us, or Malus, who seems to be probing our soul, as if driven by a surprising curiosity when looking at us. But there's no way to do a pacifist run. You have to kill them because the statues have to be destroyed. While some games give you a choice as to how you deal with enemies, or at least some of them, kill them or spare them, as in Undertale, Deltarune, or the later Assassin's Creed, here only death counts. A pacifist run would make no sense. It would simply mean that Wander gave up on his quests. Dormin would not recover their soul, thus bring back Mono's. These Colossi have no name in the game. After all, it wouldn't matter or even make sense, since the hero only seeks to kill them once the deal with Dormin has been made. If there is indeed an exposition, there are no acts in the gameplay. There are names in the game files, and the Colossi have very popular names given by the community, but not by Dormin or Wander. Dormin introduces each clue with the same words, thy next foe, and sometimes refers to several Colossi with similar clues, showing indirectly that these creatures seem unimportant because they are not very different for them, and perhaps for Wander too. Despite this zoomorphism or anthropomorphism, the fact that we have to attack only the Colossus sigils means that during combat we only see the part of the Colossus body where the symbol is. At that point they are reduced to these symbols, mere targets that are to vanish. Wander's action dehumanizes the Colossi, often reducing them to a body part. Their reaction is always visible, however. It's a bit ambivalent, since what Wander does highlights the fact that these Colossi are animate creatures, while at the same time denying them this humanity by limiting them to mere body parts and sigils to be stabbed. It's worth noting, however, that the Colossi aren't really animated until we enter their arena. We see a few cutscenes during which a Colossus seemingly wakes up, such as Gaius, the magnificent Phaedra, or Pelagia, and sometimes we see it immediately active, such as Celosia, and especially the exceptional staging of Argus' entrance. Yet apparently they are dormant, and then, when they see us or as we approach, or even on Dormin's command, they awaken. Their consciousness only lasts for the duration of the battle. But isn't it even more cruel to awaken strangely dormant creatures in order to kill them? In the end, perhaps this is where we can best see one of the game's metaphors, the destruction of nature by man. Seeing the young man attack the Colossi, hearing them suffer, makes us quickly see Wando's quest as bad, clearly portraying him as an anti-hero ready to destroy imposing but innocent creatures for a selfish purpose. However, the music will vary the atmospheres, blurring the lines a little as to what it should feel like for us to fight these creatures. Each Colossus is associated with 2, for 7 Colossi, or 3, for 9 Colossi, musics. In most cases, for Colossi with 3 musics, the first is short, around 30 seconds, played only once and accompanies the arrival near the Colossus lair. It's rather informative, we're in the right place. The first one we hear, Sign of the Colossus, is used each time in a shorter version. Not all these cues have the same atmosphere. Sign of the Colossus is dark, generally indicating the place or door from which a Colossus will emerge. It's danger, or Wando's contempt, that dominates. Lakeside, green hills and a closed-off city are softer, probably putting more emphasis on the place where the Colossus is located. The latter is invisible during the cutscene except for Zenobia, who is briefly seen at the end of the long shot of the ruins, motionless. Sanctuary is more pronounced, more active, as it accompanies the opening of the door leading to Malus, the last Colossus, in a zone which can only be entered once the previous 15 Colossi have been killed. There are 2 different cases, however. For Kumomori and Phalanx, the first of the 3 pieces is looped and accompanies the first phase of the battle. Black Blood for the former, which is quite tense as we are informed that the Colossus is dangerous, it has a sort of electric barrier, and Silence for the latter as it flies peacefully over the desert. It's worth noting that the actual presentation of the Colossus is done without music, except for Bassaran, whose music starts partially during the cutscene when we arrive in front of its cave, allowing us to really focus on the Colossus without the slightest influence. I think this is a nice way to introduce them. For the fight itself, there are generally two types of music. The change happens either when you climb on the Colossus or put it in a position of weakness, or if you trigger a specific cutscene that marks an important change during the fight. When Vadus kneels, this is however optional, Gaius, Seleucia and Zenobia lose part of their armor, or Argus, wounded, drops its weapon. As the Colossi have neither the same stature nor the same behavior towards us, there are 13 battle musics. They are often used during a specific phase of the battle. The open way is always used in Phase 2, for instance. However, one music can be heard in Phase 1 and 2. In O, the Power is heard in Phase 1 for Gaius and Phalanx, but in Phase 2 for Hydrus and Pelagia. And some pieces essentially work together, linked by their key and meter, simple or compound, grotesque figures and the open way. A violent encounter and revived power. Liberated Guardian, and a Despair-filled farewell. The general idea behind the music for the fight's phases is that the first phase, the approach, is darker than the second phase, when Wander can finally attack the Colossus, or at least its sigils. The negative emotions associated with the Colossus are expressed first. the danger their attacks may represent, the thorough study of their movements and body from a safe distance, even the contempt Wander might feel about them. After all, the first battle music we hear is called Grotesque Figures, a point I'll come back to later. Once the first phase has been completed, it's time to express more positive emotions from the player's and perhaps Wander's point of view. The enthusiasm of getting the upper hand on a seemingly inaccessible or indomitable giant, and asserting, albeit temporarily, his superiority over the Colossus. The adrenaline of having to struggle against its movements, defying the elements at times too, in a fight that can go from frustration to a form of wonder. Some moments are truly magnificent. I'm thinking in particular of the fight against Avian, one of my favorites, and the hope for the young man to get closer to a reunion with Mono, or at least to know that she is alive. The difference is made from the very first fight, which, after using a short version of Sign of the Colossus to show us where to go, now uses grotesque figures, then the open way, if the Colossus is stabbed twice so that it will kneel. The very first Colossus, Valus, is thus introduced musically with a very negative preconception. Grotesque figures particularly clearly states those negative emotions I mentioned earlier. As far as the instrumentation is concerned, the brass is in the spotlight, but not very radiant, rather heavy, and the woodwinds, particularly the piccolo, are strident here. The orchestra almost sounds out of tune. Is this a way of establishing what Wander might think of the Colossi, if he actually does? The second element is what I would call the difficulty of the melody. The first attempt at a musical phrase is immediately rather strained by the augmented second B-A-flat and disappears almost as quickly in favor of more limited and, above all, nagging motifs, lots of chromaticisms that sometimes interrupt the supposedly melodic element that's trying to develop. It's even worse in the second half, where we can no longer even speak of an attempt at a melody. A very short gesture, EFB, is repeated, mirrored, which seems to go in circles. One can create a melodic intention even with few notes. The oboe in the sunken glades at the beginning of Ori and the Blind Forest. There are 3 notes mainly, but there's a clear melodic evolution. But here it seems as if the composer wants to make a mockery of the melody, as if the Colossi weren't capable or worthy of it. The motif is in fact used later as an ostinato. The effect is amplified by other elements. The brass are really treated to the point of grotesque, and at the beginning we hear an obsessive Jaws-like half-tone, reinforcing the implacable rhythm of the score. Once the Colossus kneels down, the music is now the open way. The orchestral color changes, softened by the strings which take over, and so does the melody. It's immediately clear, developing throughout the piece. This is a fairly decisive element to clearly distinguish the two phases. Often, the melody is established and develops on a larger scale, and doubt seems to disappear. There is no longer any melodic tension. Compare, for example, a violent encounter and revived power. Or in awe of the power and counterattack, the latter being even more striking when contrasted with the messenger from behind in the fight against Stirge, sounding like absolute liberation. The fight against Argus, the penultimate Colossus, is no exception to the rule, with the first phase using Gatekeeper of the Castle runes. The melody is clear, but tension is created by the augmented second E-flat F-sharp, a tension that disappears with the return of the open way. As I said, while each track is associated with a specific phase, this is not the case for In Awe of the Power, which appears in Phase 1 and Phase 2. In these cases, when it's in Phase 2, it contrasts with Silence or Creeping Shadow, slower musics for Colossi elegantly roaming their environment. The musics of Vadus, the first Colossus, establish all the musical elements with perhaps the excess that makes them very understandable. On the one hand, the opposition between the two main phases of the fight, for most of the Colossi. Some of them are, however, handled a little differently. And on the other hand, the musical elements come on to almost all of these battle tracks. Although their choice depends on the characteristics of the Colossus, in order to maintain consistency throughout the score, the same tools are used in almost all of them. The first function of the Colossus music is illustrative. Shadow of the Colossus is a serious game. Wander's quest is introduced and shown with the same seriousness. His fate soon becomes quite obvious, and the game often conveys a form of ineluctability in some of its elements. As I said earlier, it's austere. It's important that the music initially matches the physical image of the Colossi, without prejudging what we think of them, which can be nuanced and will of course be nuanced by the music. Firstly, they are massive, often have a strong inertia, they do not speak. The counterpoint, whose importance increases throughout the introduction, we move from static, vertical, systematic writing to richer, horizontal writing, partially gives way to something simpler, rawer, as massive as the Colossi themselves. There's almost always a thematic element in parallel octaves, the simplest counterpoint since it uses the first harmonic of each note, mostly on the strings, giving the impression of a large, unmovable sound mass, just like these creatures, as if the music too possessed inertia. This, of course, also contributes to the very color of the score, massive and intense, and, for the strings, a little arid because of these parallel octaves. Despite this mass, some Colossi are fast, and even for the slowest, the fact of being high up or tossed about while the creature's struggling will often create speed anyway. Avian seems very slow while you're observing it, but once you jump onto its wing, the sensation is quite different. In each piece, therefore, we'll hear perpetual motions, very fast, obsessive, ineluctable conjunct motions. They sometimes echo the previous idea of orchestral mass when they are in the foreground, also in parallel octaves. Although they're fast, these passages are not trailing. These perpetual motions can also be used for some of the slow colossi, such as in Awe of the Power for Gaius, evoking urgency in the face of what you can't escape, the Colossus attacks. The contrast is all the stronger with the second music, The Open Way. Its slower tempo and longer rhythm figures also contrast with the first phase, underlining that the real battle is about to begin. Moreover, as this is the first battle music we hear again, apart from Sign of the Colossus, which is not, however, battle music, just an introduction, it can sound reassuring. We're getting used to the Colossi, the way to handle combat, and hearing a familiar music again can give us that feeling and convince us that we now know what to do, just as hearing it again later for the 15th Colossus, Argus, perhaps foreshadows the culmination, the end of a cycle, the imminence of the sacrifice. It's a similar effect for a violent encounter, used for two slow-moving bosses but featuring in the background a perpetual, truly obsessive motion, which here can be felt more as a rumble. You feel the overall sound effect much more than you hear the succession of notes. The two colossi, Quadratus and Bassaran, are similar in appearance and combat. You have to knock them over before climbing on them, this step being greeted with enthusiasm by revived power. Rapid stepwise motions are again present, but these are more audible and, in a different context, evoke something else, the adrenaline of succeeding in bringing down the giant, now still, at least for a while. Revived Power is a particularly positive piece of music with its compound rhythm and elated melody working in cycles, a great upward motion that comes back again and again, carried along by its obsessive, intoxicating rhythm. One Colossus is so fast that it pursues us relentlessly. It's puppy dog-eyed Dirge. However, its music doesn't feature any particularly fast rhythm figures, apart from a few scales which are not used here the same way they are in the other pieces. Instead, it relies on a relentless rhythm and systematic intervals, insisting, once again, on ineluctability rather than speed. Rhythmically, there's something specific to each Colossus. The same attack is almost always used by Wander in combat. The music, therefore, often results to what could be called move painting. It's like word painting in music, but for a movement. That is to say that it expresses the idea of the dagger musically, rhythmically, through the recurrence of a cell made up of a long rhythm figure, and then a short, melodically resolving one, which becomes pure terror in A Messenger from Behind. It can also be seen as a way of expressing either the power of the Colossi or Wander's gaining the upper hand over these giants, notably in the intros and outros of the battle musics. They are not used in-game, but we hear them in the soundtrack. They often feature very specific rhythmic and melodic cells combining the affirmation of power with a rather suspended, even suspenseful effects. In any case, rhythm is extremely important and completely structures the score, reinforcing the theme of ineluctability by repeating the same rhythmic accompaniment. It can also be via a particular color, as in Despair-filled Farewell, very striking because of its percussion, more prominent than in the other pieces, and its overall more intense development in the second part. I feel a kind of culmination of all the themes already addressed by the music: urgency, fatality, but also adrenaline, the exhilaration of a difficult but spectacular battle, of a giant that's about to be brought down. Finally, there's often a short descending motif, repeating the short flute gesture heard several times at the beginning of the introduction. I'll study this in detail in the next section on the Forbidden Lands. Either a half tone or a tone, but a motif generally used plaintively. Some of the pieces slightly shift from this musical treatment. The more pacifist colossi, notably Avian and Phalanx, are introduced by silence. It's not the same thing at all. The writing is horizontal in the opening, a fugato, which means that its structure is similar to a fugue. A recognizable thematic element is regularly taken up by different sections of the orchestra, yet with less rigor than an actual fugue, which follows numerous rules. Just like in the game's introduction, but here with slower gestures. The polyphony is finer, more transparent, there are no longer parallel octaves. However, the plaintive descending motions I mentioned earlier are still present. Even the most peaceful colossi carry with them a certain mystery. Creeping Shadows is another piece used for colossi whose approach relies more on stealth. Phaedra, we use underground runes to attract its attention, and Pelagia, it's harmless as long as you stay underwater, but it can hurt you if you're on the surface. While the perpetual motion of the strings is fairly light, although tense, the theme is stated in parallel octaves. The link is made more clearly with the other musics. It also differs from silence through the use of more tense elements right from the start, such as the initial sound effect reminiscent of a colossus cry, the intervals in the first phrases, and the somewhat strange glissandos in the development. The colossi using this music can hurt us during this phase, unlike those using silence. Demise of the Ritual is the final piece, completely different from the rest. It accompanies the entire fight against Madus and rather strongly rejects everything we've heard before. There's no longer this idea of contrasting the approach of a presumably dangerous Colossus with the exhilaration of having taken it down. Madus is a particular Colossus, gigantic and imposing because of its size and immobility. It can't move as it seems bolted to the ground, but it defends itself, throwing projectiles that are virtually impossible to dodge. A long progression through underground tunnels and then on the Colossus itself allows us to reach its back, then its hands, then its head. The religious color of the score, which is clearly heard in the prologue and the epilogue, or when the statues of the Colossi collapse in the sanctuary, asserts itself as the ritual is about to be completed. Note the treatment of the choir in this initial ostinato. We hear quite clearly, rather in the made voices, an attempt at a speech where the changing vowels give the impression that an actual text is chanted here. The melody takes up the idea of the descending motif I mentioned earlier, like the motifs heard in the introduction. The melodic elements are almost exclusively treated this way. They are essentially descending motions, and if at first there's an attempt at an opening by the choir's generally ascending motion, very soon the theme of fatality returns. First through the continuo, the accompaniment, which limits the freedom of the flute and the English horn's melodic lines. At the second iteration, the counterpoint is slightly enriched by a cell on the flute, but it's all in vain. A very intense descending motion on the English horn, followed by the repetition, again ineluctable, of a descending motif, bring this opening to an end, reinforced by the bells and organ, in case we'd still have some doubts. The rhythmic ostinato, the continuo, disappears, however, and the next phrase seems softer, more aerial, immediately negated by the response. A final, almost violent outburst in this context concludes the loop, a last, very intense attempt summoning the whole orchestra, the whole choir, but it ends on that very last descending gesture, which decidedly haunts the score, sending us back again and again to the first scene. Whatever the Colossus, whatever the confrontation, it always ends the same way, with the same music. I'll come back to this in a few minutes. A gentle choral passage seems to belie the prior elation, condemning Wander's final stab that brings the giant to the ground. "What have you done?" it seems to sing each time, as the invariable repetition only amplifies said condemnation. One more creature down. But even before the death of the Colossus, hasn't the music already been lying to us? Who considers Colossi to be mere grotesque figures, to quote the title of one of the pieces? Wander, one might think, but we don't really know how he looks at the Colossi. He doesn't seem to have the slightest qualm about slaughtering them, but we don't know how he actually feels about these creatures. The young man is rather blinded. So, is it the player? I suppose that those who love Shadow the Colossus love the giants. Their design is often spectacular, magnificent. Could it be Dormin, then? Are these figures grotesque because they each contain a fragment of their soul and are tied to Dormin's imprisonment? Who's feeling the revived power? Wanda, perhaps? Yet isn't the player complaining about the latter, who clings with difficulty to the fur and drops his hand at the slightest movement of the Colossus? Does the strangeness of this fight deserve such an acceleration? This is no virtuosic fight, and Wanda is always on the verge of losing his balance. It's not a matter of precision or dodging, but of patience. Yet, it's true, climbing onto Avian and running on its body from one end to the other in mid-air is absolutely exhilarating, but in Shadow of the Colossus, everything is so fragile. Wanda could fall at any moment. Argus shakes so badly that it's almost impossible to charge the slightest stab without the attack being cancelled, which is very frustrating. Success is fleeting. The music also contributes to the absence of humor I mentioned earlier, even if some confrontations are less solemn in their staging or put the Colossi in a situation that could make you smile. I am thinking in particular of Bassaran when it's wobbling on 2 feet because of the geysers. The powerlessness of these creatures, who seem to be revived by Dormin only to die a few minutes later, can dampen the mood. Wanda's selfishness is certainly reinforced by the fate suffered by the few other characters, notably his faithful horse, Agro. She sacrifices herself before the final battle. As a bridge collapses, she sends Wanda on the other side before falling into the river below. She escapes, however, heavily wounded, but Wanda will not know about this. He dies just before. But this selfishness is also counterbalanced by his sacrifice, which he must have guessed. Dormin warns Wanda at the very beginning. Bringing back Mono's soul will come at a great cost. Wanda completely brushes off this warning very simply, almost coldly. It doesn't matter. It's easy to understand that the price to be paid could be his own life. It's highly likely that Wanda, like the player, interprets this warning as a threat of his own death, or, at the very least, a gruesome fate. Mono is therefore more important than Wanda's own life. More than living with her, he would like Mono to live, and that's not selfish, at least not entirely. Mono's death is not due to him. She was sacrificed because she was cursed. It seems inconceivable to the player. This only element of her life is source of immediate empathy with Mono and, for some time, with Wanda. Faced with a sacrifice that we can only imagine is unfair, Wanda responds with other sacrifices, that of the Colossi and his own. If it's noble to sacrifice oneself so that Mono may live, it's selfish to sacrifice the Colossi so that the girl may be resurrected. One could imagine that Wanda might not see the humanity the player sees in this Colossi. He's blinded by hatred, but the player doesn't see this hatred either. Wanda's only visible and rare emotions are turned towards Mono. At one point, we see him stroke her cheek. The only empathy one could feel towards Wanda would be that of losing Mono, much likely his dearly beloved, since this is the only thing that defines him. Wanda is therefore an almost blank page to which we can ascribe intentions, but for which we can find excuses, perhaps to prevent our feelings towards Wanda from only turning to contempt. Despite being dead or without her soul for most of the game, Mono is not entirely erased from the story, and even before the epilogue she manages to take part. After the death of each of the Colossi, when Wanda returns to the altar through that strange black and white tunnel, we hear Mono's voice more and more present. The developers explain that she is asking Wanda not to perform the ritual. She gradually regains her soul, while Wanda gradually loses his, corrupted by Dormin, who makes Wanda their host, and the game allows us to become aware of this. Similarly, the end credits showing the Colossi, imposing but fundamentally organic creatures, returned to a state of dust, are what Mono sees when her soul is brought back in her body and she comes back to life. She immediately witnesses what Wanda has done, despite what she asked him. The emphasis on the organic nature of these creatures and the contrast with their often spectacular appearance, which disappears completely after death, contributes to the ecological metaphor for the game. Despite this lack of empathy towards the Colossi, and in spite of the fact that he opposes Mono's will, whatever her reason for doing so, Wanda is not the only one to blame. While the Forbidden Lands are home to no one other than Dormin, the Colossi, and a few animals, there are other characters, notably one involved in Wander's story. Upon Wander's arrival, a voice tells the story of the Forbidden Lands. It is the voice of a shaman, Lord Demon. After the young man has slain the 12th Colossus, Lord Demon and some of his men are seen on their way to the Forbidden Lands to prevent Wander from carrying out the ritual. His role in the story, however, is unclear, not fully asserted. He knows Wander and the sword. We don't know if it was his own sword, and it seems likely that he is connected to Mono's sacrifice. The soldiers wear clothes similar to Wander's and are probably of his people. It turns out that Lord Demon is also connected to Dormin. Indeed, Dormin's soul has been divided into 16 parts, each of which is imprisoned in one of the colossi of these far-off lands. Dormin clearly associates Lord Demon, rather his ancestors, with this sacrifice, although no reason is given. Indeed, no reason is ever given in this story, perhaps to, again, summon the idea of ineluctability. Whatever the starting point, the end is the same. Reasons no longer matter. Dormin thus uses Wander as a mere body in order to lift the curse of Iman's ancestors, which is made all the more clear by the fact that Wander's appearance changes over the course of the game. His complexion grows paler and paler to the point that it looks cadaverous, black mottling appears on his body and horns grow on his head. When Lord Demon finally arrives at the temple, Wander has already killed the last Colossus and Dormin's soul is now complete in the young man's body. His repulsive, cadaverous appearance alarms Iman, who orders him killed. He makes this decision without the slightest hesitation, the slightest doubt, but it's too late. Dormin has taken possession of Wander's body and the young man is now transforming into a Shadow Colossus. Lord Demon manages to go back up to the shrine's entrance and leave, not without throwing the sword into the small body of water at the very bottom of the temple, causing a vortex of light to appear, sucking in any shadow creature, that is to say Dormin. Everything that makes them a Colossus disappears, leaving only Wander's body visible, still looking like a shadowy creature. But it's Wander all right. We hear his voice, his gasps as he reaches for the altar where Mono still lies dead. He struggles against the blast, the vortex that draws him inexorably towards the light. This is not a cutscene, the player is controlling Wander. His stamina still enabling him to grab the steps, the edges, but he's eventually sucked in. During this scene, a very familiar music is used. We've heard it 16 times before. It's the music, the lament, that accompanies the slow death of a Colossus. After all, Dormin takes on the appearance of a Colossus and Lord Demon in turn kills one of them in order to kill Wander at the same time, almost the same way as all the other Colossi were killed, using the ancient sword. Lord Demon will never be seen regretting either ordering Wander to be killed as the latter killed the Colossi, or having, although he may not be aware of it, locked Mono away for life in these lands. There's not even a single word for her. Or even, but this is just a theory, the regret of killing Mono. The end of battle music is very special in that it never ceases to contradict itself in a way. It is often pointed out, and rightly so, as sounding at odds with any usual end-of-battle fanfare. It's not hard to hear why, as the design of the Colossi quickly underlines the absurdity and pain of their death, in response to the absurdity of Mono's death. It's hard to imagine what a cursed soul would be. All the Colossi, including the smallest and most nervous ones, die slowly, collapsing heavily onto the ground or falling into the water, except Malus, who, bolted in place, can't actually fall down. Its torso bends, but that's all. So we can't use a dynamic fanfare as we systematically witness the death, rather the agony, of the creatures. It uses elements present throughout the music of the game, very solemn, even religious elements. The choir, without words here, like a gentle lament, using vowels that are rather closed, the organ, the bells. This non-fanfare has a second part which contrasts somewhat with the beginning of the piece. The strings, always very soft in G major. There's no extreme register, it's a slow melody beginning with an arpeggio. When used during Wanda's death, the second part is longer and introduces another motif, a descending halftone, B-B-flat, that disrupts the key. It's still G major, so definitely with a B natural. Also disrupted by the deafening noise of the vortex of light and the noises expressing Wanda's efforts and despair, as the altar where Mono lies draws away from him and he is unable to see her alive even one last time. Beyond the purity of the images used in the game, the dead girl, the desperate young man, the bird, and the almost monolithic way in which Wanda is portrayed, the game is far from offering a black and white treatment to its characters and its seemingly limpid plot. Dormin, taking advantage of Wanda's distress to lift the curse that has locked their soul in the Colossi, keeps their word. Mono comes back to life just as Agro returns to the shrine, one leg injured but very much alive. Wanda is strangely alive, but she now has the appearance of a baby, having retained the horns of Dormin's body. Lord Demon has fled with his soldiers, the bridge collapsing behind them like a last colossus brought down, probably by Lord Demon's magic, trapping Mono, Agro and Wanda in these forbidden lands. Agro, however, leads Mono to a garden at the very top of the temple, home to life. Animals, plants, fruit. We glimpse the hope of a strange life there, perhaps, as a bird flies away, the speed of its flight contrasting with the slowness of descending, and its absolute freedom, is there greater freedom than a flying bird, suddenly reminding us that despite the hope of a possible life in those forbidden lands, no character, no creature in this game will ever be able to taste the freedom of this bird. The Forbidden Lands are a strange place, realistic but impossible, which nevertheless promises to make the impossible possible, return a lost soul to its body. It's a place where a strange entity resides that can only be heard, an apparently immortal entity. Dormin often mentions Wanda's mortality, the laws of mortals, as if to contrast with their own immortality. It's also a strange world where it's easier to face Colossi than to destroy statues. Let's take a look at how this place is musically introduced. The score of Shadow of the Colossus focuses on the orchestra, a symphonic orchestra, quite classical in its instrumentation, strings, brass, woodwinds, percussion, no surprise, with a few non-orchestral instruments, notably the bouzouki, as the composer did not want to make references that would be too specific to one country, in favor of a very solemn cadre, religious even often, with the organ and the choir. The first part of the introduction, the first cutscene before the menu screen, depicts the long journey of Wanda, Agro and Mono, culminating in their arrival at the bridge. This journey is shown in several stages, which the music will of course emphasize, although throughout the introduction it retains a deep sense of balance, elegance, and orchestral mastery. The very first scene introduces the characters through the bird, whose rapid flight, amplified by a sound design that's probably a bit extreme, disturbs a young man, Wanda, carefully carrying a presumably human body on his horse, protected by a blanket. This is worrying because it implies that the person under this blanket is either asleep or dead, but who would stay asleep for so long without moving in such conditions? Which of the countless moonlit structures is he heading for? Questions are already being asked. The function of this first scene is fulfilled. The music begins with a question and answer game between a few almost improvised gestures on what sounds like a koto and a much more static choir which discreetly accompanies the koto with held notes or conjunct motions and opens up very slightly in response to it. It is treated almost exclusively in homorhythm, so the writing is vertical, which makes the whole sound very calm and, as I said earlier, perfectly balanced. It's soft because there are no consonants, no attacks, everything is sung with the mouth open, but the vowels are not completely open and evolve very little. Lastly, the organ reinforces the choir's verticality as its sound wraps, coats the choir's sound, and of course it heralds the work's religious imagery. There's a nice contrast between the koto in tension release, particularly in the third iteration, which is more hurried than the others because it's longer, and the choir much more static. In any case, the koto's outbursts have something more organic about them, and as they're oriented towards the dominant, D, we're in G minor, they're more open than the choir's responses, which are more focused on the tonic, G, but not totally closed. A third element systematically closes each sequence of this introduction. A descending motion on the flute, plaintive but not played with too much intensity. On the contrary, there's a little vibrato, almost too little, as this motif sounds too straight, as if restraining itself from giving in to despair. This results in a strange sensation of calm once again, even though this kind of musical gesture, without generalizing, can introduce a form of suffering and of structure through the invariable construction of these three sequences. Everything is very solemn, but something is missing. It's not dark, it's even quite magical, the color of the choir being sublimated by the nocturnal ambience, but it's a little withdrawn. The first scene also sketches the bond between Wanda and his mount, Agro. She trusts Wanda enough, and vice versa, to cross a large gap in the stone path, and we find ourselves interpreting her reaction as relief after jumping over the gap, a relief enhanced by the silence since the music stops at this point. This is our first contact with Agro's realism, which has been very well developed. During exploration, she often moves away from Wanda when he's on foot, becomes frightened if he shoots an arrow near her, and runs away when the courtesy represents too great a danger. At the end of this first scene, the strings introduce a more developed and dynamic descending motion, descending thirds, more extroverted in its sadness precisely because it is less controlled. It is taken up again with just one more note, like a sentence we would like to say in its entirety, but which does not seem to be able to cross our lips, which then disappears in a sigh before the choir and the orchestra move on to the second, more active sequence. We follow Wanda's journey and become aware of how long it lasts. What is this young man's destination? Why is he taking a body with him? The choir is more active, the rhythms are faster, and the exchange between male and female voices happens on a smaller scale. The koto is now in the background, doubling the upper melodic line of the female choir. The vowels seem more complex, giving the impression that a text is being sung as if explaining, without us being able to understand it, the reasons that drive this young man to travel before the flute returns, still with this roll of brief punctuation that seems strangely almost disconnected from the rest. Perhaps because of its extreme simplicity. It's just a descending major or minor second, but it's a motif that is found very often in the score. A new sequence, focusing on the strings this time, begins. This entire section is treated as a fugato. Here it's notably the motif in thirds, heard at the end of the first sequence, that comes to the foreground, descending, then ascending. The counterpoint is thus more complex than before, and the initial tranquility is slightly disturbed, although the characteristic motif recedes into the background, only to return at shorter intervals. There is a feeling of precipitation, as we hear the motif twice per bar instead of once, while at last the forbidden lands are within our reach. A symbol of hope for Wanda, a hope that is now very concrete for the young man as he finally faces the entrance. They are underlined by a generous upward camera movement and, above all, the powerful, intense entrance of the double basses. The strings are finally complete. This lasts just 2 bars. The low strings fade as Wander moves forward like a furtive doubt, but the choir returns, accompanying the now warmer light inside the Forbidden Lands. There's a real opening movement in the sung vowels as the lands unfold before us, and so does the orchestra. The choir's speech becomes even more active as we hear a faster ascending counterpoint. The syllables become richer, giving the impression of a fuller speech before a final descending motion drags us away as the camera reveals the bridge and the void at its feet. The first part of the introduction ends on this vertiginous shot and chord, a C major chord that's absolutely breathtaking in its ability to transcribe the architecture of the site, of the bridge in particular. Impressive but empty as the chord fades away in a beautiful decrescendo to let silence settle in, a diegetic silence that will also be an integral part of the adventure. The mystery of the first scene with the bird has given way to the hope that the Forbidden Lands represent for Wander, a first hope that is expressed in an intense but still solemn and balanced way, in line with that austerity I developed in the second part of the video. The player, however, still knows little of the story, having followed, in part, Wander's physical and emotional path. The second part of the introduction, after the menu screen, will answer our questions. We might have suspected that Wander was carrying a body on his horse Agro, but the music reveals a much more elegiac color. The orchestra, previously limited to strings and flute gestures, is more complete with more woodwinds. We enter the shrine where Dormin will manifest themselves. They're undoubtedly a divine entity, and Wander's pain, due to the loss of Mono's soul, is revealed. The work's religious tone intensifies, with bells now playing, and we can already hear the difference between the flute's interventions and those from the beginning. Here there is no longer any distance from the rest of the orchestra. They are integrated into the elegy. The musical discourse no longer follows the initial construction, the koto, the choir's response, the flute's conclusion. This whole first phrase is more fluid and, most of all, more melodically developed, unlike what's heard next when Wander is about to lay Mono on the altar. The music follows the rhythm of Wander's footsteps, linking this motif, almost an ostinato, to the ineluctability of Mono's death, which he is about to reveal. The notion of ineluctability appears several times in the game. This is almost impossible for him, and we see that he waits for some time before laying her on the altar. He is already at the top of the steps, and the camera passes behind a pillar. When the altar reappears, Mono's body is still in Wander's arms. After he removes the blanket protecting the girl, the expression on his face mingles sadness and perhaps a form of contemplation. Hope has disappeared in favor of Wander's expression of grief, but what follows is a resurgence of this hope. Before that, two things need to be clarified. The story of these places, narrated by a shaman, Lordiman, a rather vague story that includes the possibility of bringing back the soul of a dead person, and how it is forbidden to enter the lands. We understand Wander's intentions and the prohibition he has violated. Finally, the eruption of the shadow creatures reveals Wander's main gameplay weapon, the ancient sword. All he has to do is brandishing it before a spell makes these humanoid creatures disappear. It is this sword, and not Wander himself, that arouses Dormin's interest. Lordiman's narration was accompanied by a rather traditional flute and introduced some more oniric elements, developed in the Attack of the Shadows, Black Blood, more synthetic, and which will only be heard again at the very end of the adventure. Dormin's awakening takes up the religious codes, organ, choir, but adds a light, albeit very relative, that was absent from the whole part in the shrine. Most of the dialogue is spoken without music, but it returns to show the contrast between Wander's despair and the hope that Dormin represents, a contrast underlined by Wander's head movement. When Dormin explains that no lost soul can be recovered, the young man lowers his head like he did before in front of Mono, but here he seems despondent because of Dormin's words. Dormin qualifies what they've just said, and Wander immediately raises his head. The music from the previous scene resumes as Dormin describes to Wander what he must do and warns him of the price to be paid. Yet Wander dismisses the warning, it doesn't matter, and as the camera invites us to explore the Forbidden Lands, a deceptive exploration, the music opens with a burst from the choir. At last, hope has returned to Wander. He has a goal, 16 goals. But Dormin brings him back to reality and the camera takes us back to the sanctuary. This game will not be an exploration, but a hunt. The Forbidden Lands are an impossible place and, as the name suggests, forbidden, yet it has a purpose. It's far away, the journey takes at least a whole night, which can obviously be interpreted in a very metaphorical way, we'll come back to this. It's difficult to get to. We see Wander and Agro following a path over a very steep cliff, a path sometimes destroyed, we see Agro jump, in an extremely impressive and fragmented landscape. It's high up, far away, and once there you still have to cross that iconic structure, the bridge. It's a symbol of the impossibility of the Forbidden Lands, for this bridge, although it's magnificent, is impossible. It's too high, too narrow, it's impossible for two people to stand side by side on the deck, and its arches are asymmetrical. They point in a single direction, placed on numerous pillars that are also too narrow, which in turn stand in groups of 3 on other pillars. Call me an architect or an engineer. Now, such a bridge cannot physically remain standing, but that's obviously not important here. On the contrary, the link between the Forbidden Lands, which no mortal can or should enter, and the rest of the world must make this prohibition explicit. Yet the arches of the bridge all point towards the temple. They invite us to move forward to enter these Forbidden Lands. The bridge is like a metonymy of the place in the sense that its architecture reflects that of the entire place. It's a bridge of considerable dimensions, extremely high and long. It takes between 8 and 9 minutes to run across it, but it's also a very narrow bridge and therefore empty, just like the expanses at our feet. Plains, desert, forest, all are wide, all are empty. Let's be clear, it's an emptiness that seems extremely natural. I really like the treatment of the vegetation, often dense, very convincing and animated with beautiful physics, disappearing when necessary. The cliffs are vertiginous and once again the render distance, if it takes away the mystery of the fog in the original version, allows us to become fully aware of the beauty of the composition of the Forbidden Lands. Just because it's austere doesn't mean it's bland. The biomes complement each other, like the desert and the forest, most luxuriant, providing a little humidity and protection. Nevertheless, these wide expanses are desperately empty. The bridge is fragile but still standing, as if untouched. The fact that it's still standing seems to imply that no one has ever actually crossed it, that no one has ever entered these Forbidden Lands. The only time this bridge is crossed in the other direction, it collapses. It seems to happen thanks to magic, probably Lordiman's doing, but the movement of the arches gives the impression that crossing this structure in the other direction will cause it to collapse somehow, and that even if Wander isn't necessarily the first to enter the lands, no one before him has ever come out. It's also an impossible place because it seems to have risen out of the sand. And yet it's realistic. The graphic style is extremely realistic, as are the proportions of the characters, excluding the Colossi, and the animals, excluding the Colossi, and Nagro, which is apparently taller than the world's tallest horse. But who built it? Lordiman? Dormin themselves? It feels out of the world, all the more so as its architecture, like the music, is not associated with any particular civilization, even if influences can be found. As a result, it's almost a place that feels out of time. Indeed, while we see the journey taking place largely at night, in the game there is no day-night cycle. According to the developers, however, it's implied that Wander's adventure takes place over several days. As I said, this flow of time can also be interpreted as a metaphor for Wander's isolation. As long as he is not in the Forbidden Lands, he is withdrawn, and the rising sun, as he arrives in front of the large structures, is like an awakening of his hope, that of seeing Mono alive again. From the moment the quest begins, as Dormin seems confident of their ability to bring Mono's soul back, there is no more night for Wander. Time slowly unfreezes in the Forbidden Lands when Wander arrives, but while this may be a symbol of his awakening, it is mostly that of Dormin. The night returns with the bird's flight. The Forbidden Lands are also a deceptive place, like Dormin and the game as a whole. If it's immense, there's ultimately very little to do there. We can explore it, there's nothing to prevent us from going almost anywhere and simply wandering around, but there's nothing to be found from Wander's point of view, which doesn't mean we won't find something and enjoy ourselves. But we won't progress in the quest. The order of the Colossi is set, they're invisible until it's their turn to fall, and we won't discover any other one. This is where the player's experience differs from that of the character. Wander doesn't walk, he doesn't explore. He actually doesn't wander, he seeks battle. The Forbidden Lands are off-limits, but accessible. How clever is that? The bridge deceptively invites us in, and in the shrine, a strange and impressive altar seems to await this soulless body, even though no one is supposed to use the spell which may bring a soul back to its body. It's an open world, you can explore almost all of it from the beginning of the adventure, but the progression is linear. Dormin controls it, dictating the order of the Colossi. Lastly, it's open, but Wander's life and destiny are closed. Indeed, there is no greatness in Wander's destiny, since his life is focused solely on Mono and admittedly a Grow, but that's a very close circle. He doesn't save a people or a place. What's more, he's almost doomed from the moment he accepts Dormin's quest. In the long introductory cutscene, when we arrive at the shrine, we are constantly drawn back to the center of the place. Everything leads us back to Dormin. As we arrive inside the shrine, the camera moves to a circular opening before following Wander down the spiral ramp. At the bottom, it focuses again on another circular opening, the one through which Dormin addresses us. And as the camera pans outwards, a promise of exploration for the player, of the return of Mono for Wander, we are drawn back inside, towards Dormin. We're not free at all. It also foreshadows the movement we'll have at the end, poor Shadow sucked in by the light. Although Wander is an extremely determined character, his own life eludes him since he now lives only through his quest instigated by Dormin, who uses him. He doesn't really live this adventure. In fact, as I've already mentioned, from the moment he accepts Dormin's mission, Wander no longer speaks, or at least no longer speaks to them, and it's Dormin who systematically interrupts the scenes when Wander spends a few moments with Mono. Often, even, when Wander wakes up, he looks directly at Dormin, waiting for the next clue. The religious aspect, present indirectly but not implicitly through the music, which multiplies the religious tones, directly through Dormin, who we assume is a divine entity, the idols of the Colossi, the altars where we pray as a checkpoint, is both in contradiction with and complementary to Dormin's rather diabolical appearance when they take shape, their manipulation, and the disapproval that can arise in the player from what the playable character does. But when we think about it, is Wander entirely in control of his destiny? I've mentioned this idea of ineluctability several times, and while it could be argued that he could have stopped fighting the Colossi and thus would have not brought back Mono's soul, the emphasis on ineluctability can, along with this lack of characterization, nuance the way we look at Wander, suggesting that despite his relentless hunt of all the Colossi, one after another, perhaps the hero also suffers. In the Forbidden Lands, no one is truly in control of their own destiny. Just before the battle with Malus, the last Colossus, Agro falls into a deep ravine. There is little doubt that he cannot survive such a fall, and Wander, who has just been saved by his faithful mount, takes a few moments to collect himself. This scene reuses one of the music from the prologue, a choral passage whose color can be felt as a prayer from the young man, but can also be experienced as a condemnation of Wander again. Using the same music gives the impression that Wander's quest is punctuated by losses only, that Agro is just one death among many others, since no music is customized, and this can sound like a final call to reason before the battle against Malus. It's like the death of the Colossi. Repeating the same music each time underlines that their agony is the same and supports the condemnation of this death. It's not so much the Colossus that is highlighted than the fact that it's dying. Once again, a creature has been killed. Systematically, a few moments later, the statue of the Colossus collapses, again to the same music, an organ recalling the idea of the ritual. Then, from the moment Wander triumphs over the last Colossus, the music we heard at the beginning is used again. In addition to the organ accompanying the destruction of the statues representing the Colossi, the confrontation between Lordiman and his men and Wander will feature the music heard when Wander first arrived at the sanctuary. Then, as the shadow creatures appear, we return to the synthetic layers, but most of all to the more elegiac part that accompanied the painful moment when Wander climbed the steps to the altar, laying Mono's body on it with difficulty. This takes on its full meaning as Wander's soul has not entirely left him and he reaches out to the young woman. The 16 statues have fallen, Mono's soul must be brought back in her body, just as Wander's soul seems to leave his. Dormin's soul, finally complete, possesses the young man's body. The music of Malus, the last Colossus, is heard as Lordiman and his men flee, locking Dormin, along with Wander and Mono, in the shrine. The more elegiac music resumes, and as we know, the end of fight fanfare accompanies Dormin and Wander's final moments, at least in this form. It's not over yet, and the music from the very beginning, from the first part of the introductory cutscene, will return. However, while the previous music was unchanged, the same cannot be said for this one. When Mono wakes up, we're in an aftermath for the characters, and something has changed for each of them, which may be reflected in these changes. The orchestration is different. The koto or buzuki gestures are gone, so there's no momentum. The flute doesn't have the same tone, an English horn accentuates the melancholy of the orchestral color. There are bells, and the choir is both more aerial and more intense, an intensity amplified by the tempo, which is slower than before. It's all the more concrete when we hear the descending thirds much slower and therefore much more pronounced, all the way through to the double basses, even more intense than when we arrived in the Forbidden Lands, as they are followed by the credits. The whole ending is even slower than the beginning. It's a visible slowness through the same effects as in the initial cutscene, the long shots, the camera moves, but a suggested one too, notably by Agro. She limps up the spiral ramp to show Mono the way to the garden, at the cost of a tremendous effort for the poor horse. The sequence is largely cut, but Agro's slowness in the few steps she is seen taking easily suggests that the whole scene actually takes a really long time. The music softens for the final sequence. Lordiman addresses a few words to Wander's soul. He doesn't have a single word about poor Mono. And finally, Agro leads Mono and that strange baby Wander to the garden at the top of the sanctuary. After the intensity, orchestral mass and inertia of most of the fights, the very religious color sometimes more open when Wander was still driven by the hope of bringing Mono's soul back, but which also condemned his 16 killings, this strange final scene unveils, at last, very oniric nuances, layers, organic, ethereal glissandos, nothing we've heard before. Tonally, the piece settles in rather uneasily, reflecting the questions that both the player and Mono may ask themselves. In particular, at the entrance to the garden, there's a very suspended moment with the repetition of tritone D-sharp A, then the key of C major seems to settle in, but with a heavy accent on the fourth augmented degree, F-sharp, rather unstable, because it makes a tritone again, before a clear C major arpeggio is heard. At last, there's a certain warmth in the plants, the more varied colors, the very bright white of the doves, whereas the color palettes had been rather dull until then, or at least nude and sometimes muted, and as all the animals seem to gather around Mono, Agro and Wonder in a new nativity, as the musical-lyric quality culminates in an almost synthetic choir, as it sounds and feels so unreal and otherworldly, suddenly the birds fly away, the music is almost interrupted, in an instant it's all over and we leave the Forbidden Lands thanks to the kite while they stay there. All those who can escape from the lands, the birds, Lordiman and his men, do so with an impulse that can be felt all the more intensely because it contrasts with the immobility of the garden and the overall slowness of the game. These Forbidden Lands are now sealed, condemned by Lordiman's own admission, and those who can escape, those who can still taste freedom, do so with intensity like the piano whose urgency interrupts the scene. The bird is very important as it contrasts sharply with the rest of the universe. It's fast, although it glides for a long time, and it's free. We see it flying at full speed in the introductory cutscene, ripping through the air to the point of startling Wonder, who flinches. He has to be careful not to knock Mono over or scare Agro. It's the only fast element in the Shadow of the Colossus universe. We see it again when Wonder, Agro and Mono arrive at the temple, and it's there throughout the game. One of the birds is nicknamed Loki by the community. It's like Wonder's freedom, out of him, since Wonder isn't free, following him. When it returns at the end, its movement and image are reinforced by the music, the only fast, light music in the set. There's no inertia. The extremely concrete sound of the piano contrasting with the preceding onirism, the compound rhythm right to the end, which conveys a very strong sense of urgency, like an evocation of the Carpe Diem, a call to seize the moment and thus an indirect condemnation of Wonder's, admittedly understandable, quest, locked in his past with Mono. And while the bird is flying, you can see almost all the pillars of light that appear when a Colossus dies. It's an absolute contrast with the beginning of the game, yet it closes on the same shot as the beginning of the story, a small piano motif that leads us into an A major arpeggio, ending the story on the brightest musical element there is. Yet even though there is hope in this ending, the contrast between the fate of the characters and the freedom of the bird can, as I analyzed earlier, tarnish that hope somehow. The shrine and its garden recede into the distance, the silhouettes of the characters disappear in favor of the imposing building and the flight of the kite, leaving them and their future, of which we know absolutely nothing, trapped inside these lands. I talked about this in my video on Journey. Shadow of the Colossus is a work where the notion of cycle is important, but each of these games illustrates and develops it in its own way, in its artistic elements and, of course, its story. But then I briefly added that in the case of Shadow of the Colossus, these cycles are broken. Yet the game ends as it began, since the first and last shots are identical, the flight of a bird under the magical light of a full moon. But unlike Journey's playable character, who does in fact return to their starting point, giving the impression of an infinite cycle of life and death, materialization and transformation, of a life that begins again and again but can be lived differently, especially if you experience co-op, Shadow of the Colossus is much less organic in its approach of the cycle. Although the idea of a story told over and over again is strongly felt, hence the identical shot at the beginning and at the end, with the explicit narration briefly heard at the beginning through Lord Demon's voice, this very distance can give the impression that the story is not actually intended to be renewed. The warning, an idea also present in Journey, is much more explicit, expressed at the very end by Lord Demon as he leaves the Forbidden Lands. There's also an end screen. The story is undoubtedly finished. The suspended aspect of the characters' fate, despite their seeming confinement, we don't know what happens to them afterwards, calls for new cycles that we would not, however, witness. Will Dormin be able to take shape again? After all, they were able to speak to Wander when their soul was fragmented. We could even imagine that they lured Wander in this place or even manipulated the Colossi. They were the one who gave the order of the Colossi. Were they the one behind this order? Was there a meaning to this? Was it Dormin who controlled the creatures, waking them up as Wander arrived, using this soul fragment? At one point I even thought that the first shadows we see, those that Wander dismisses with his sword, were other people who had come to beg Dormin to bring back a lost soul. The cycle began again for Dormin when Wander arrived, and even more so when he killed the last Colossus, a cycle that ended when they were swept away by the light of the spell cast by Lord Demon, so perhaps a new cycle can begin again. But the statues of the Colossi have been destroyed, and nothing or no one seems to be able to rebuild them. As for Dormin's soul, of which Wander was the gruesome vessel for a few moments, has it too disappeared into the vortex of light? It has been banished from Wander's body, but has Dormin's cycle come to an end? The two souls remain connected. Wander's soul never completely left his body, since even when possessed by Dormin, he was still guided by the wish to see Mono alive again, as emphasized by several shots from the young man's point of view, while he's desperately looking at Mono. As for Dormin, they still have an influence on Wander, even if he's now a baby. As the developers made clear, the horns are a reminder of what Wander has done, and of the influence, however small, that Dormin still has on him. Dormin themselves, during the few moments when they were able to reclaim their soul, were therefore not completely free, and Wander apparently never will be again. Wander's cycle has also been broken. The young man will never be able to live with Mono in the way he would have wished. Mono's cycle has been suddenly broken and then resumed, which is very strange. The bird itself, leaving this strange lands, lives only to return. After the end screen, the game immediately starts again from the beginning. We see the initial cutscene once more, and a new game can begin. Yet it's a departure that could be considered definitive. Unlike the other characters, the bird has no ties, it's defined only by itself, not by anyone or anything else, just as Wander is defined by his attachment to Mono, or Mono by her being sacrificed, which leads to a very strange ending, of which she's the main character, but of which she is also a complete stranger. She had to endure this strange fate to the very end. Mono, Agro, and the now baby Wander are condemned to remain in this land, just like the animals in the garden. Even this garden is strange. It seems to keep Mono, Agro, and Wander alive, even though they are locked up here now, so it allows them to stave off their mortality. Yet you can reach it before the end of the game if you have enough stamina to climb to the very top, and if you eat its fruit, you lose stamina and health. It makes you mortal again, whereas the other fruits in these lands keep you away from your own mortality. You gain health, making death more difficult in combat. However, it has a strange taste of eternity, like a hidden Eden thanks to the choice of animals, a fawn, a squirrel, that gives it a merveilleux tone. However, eternity is not possible. Mono is resurrected, but not immortal. What's more, all three of them, Mono, Wonder, and Agro, have experienced something that strongly connected them to their mortality. Wonder's arrival slowly unfreezes time as it was frozen since Dormin's curse. If those places fill us with a strong sense of eternity, time actually flows again. What happens after Dormin's banishment? The broken nature of the character's cycle is brought out by the continuity of the birds and the absence of a cycle in the music. Unlike Journey, it doesn't end as it began. The musical story, though apparently cyclical, is ultimately linear. As for the player, if they wish to escape the imprisonment, the trap that Wander's quest would represent for them, there's only one thing left to do. They can stop playing Shadow of the Colossus the way they're supposed to, abandon Mono on her altar, leave Dormin's soul locked in the sleeping Colossi, mount Agro, and keep Wander alive in the Forbidden Lands for eternity.